Welcome to the Word on Campus, where we take a behind-the-scenes look at how some of the best university podcasts get made. Joining me today is Dan Morrell. He is the Senior Associate Director of Alumni Communications and Content Manager at the Harvard Business School and the host of their alumni podcast, Skydeck. And I'll also add one more tidbit here. He is also the co-founder and partner at Dogger Consultants, who we work with at University FM. So check out the podcast that we're working on called My Finance Work. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. Today we're talking about Skydeck. So, we're going to have fun with this one. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Robert. I'm so happy to be here.
All right. So just to start off, I know a good amount about you, but let's start here. How did you land at Harvard Business School, and how did you land in the role you're in today?
Oh, man, what a long story. So I think it really goes back to one moment, right? My whole career in alumni communications goes back to one moment, and I was in grad school at Temple getting my master's in journalism, which is something someone should never pay for, but I'm still paying off. And I was offered two jobs, right? I could have gone to Dow Jones Wall Street Journal in Manhattan for $24,000 a year.
Ooh.
Yeah,
Whoa.
huge opportunity. Or it could have gone to Penn Stater, at Penn State's Alumni magazine, which I knew had historically been almost a feeder for Philadelphia magazine, which is one of the regional publications there, and which was an opportunity I really liked. But mostly it was like the money, right? It was like I couldn't live in Manhattan for $24K. So started my alumni communications career. I bounced around after Penn State. I bounced around a few things in Massachusetts. Was working at Wentworth Institute of Technology, essentially managing their alumni magazine, and then ended up at Harvard Business School. We launched the podcast. I was managing their alumni magazine. We launched the podcast about 7 or 8 years ago at this point. And it's been going strong ever since. But that's sort of the story of my career, short version.
All right. So Penn State and then Harvard. What drives you? Like, what are you passionate about in higher ed? Like, why this space?
Oh, higher ed. I think people think about that all the time. And I hear a lot of the same answers. So I'm sorry if you've heard this before, but honestly, it's the ideas, right? You get to be in a place where people are at the forefront of thinking about the next big thing, right? This is where every day you get to work with individuals who are thinking deeply about really important things, right? And also, my job is that I get to talk to all of these people, right? In my case, it's usually alumni, but people who are at the forefront of advancing these ideas, right? I get the opportunity to meet with them. I read their books. I hear about their personal stories. Like, I am by nature very curious. I want to know how things work. I want to know how people got to where they're at. I want to know what's coming up next in the future. And so this is such a rare opportunity, I think, to work at the nexus of all those really cool things, right? New ideas, exciting people, and really having a deep understanding of what's coming next.
So when you talk with people in your role, at what point did you think, okay, a podcast would be a good idea? Like, yeah.
I mean, it fit naturally, right? Like, my whole career really has been about storytelling, right? Like talking to people, understanding where they came from. I get good at talking to strangers, but I think the podcast was a new way of doing that, right? And not just from the medium, right? We know it's audio, but I saw the opportunity for a new audience, right? And potentially a younger audience. But I knew the skill set of my team, and my team skill set is storytelling, right? And this was a new medium. We are great interviewers, right? We've done it our entire careers. So it matched with who we were and what we do. And it was also something that I aspired to be good at, right? I'd seen it done. I'd seen high execution. I knew what it looked like. And I just saw a great opportunity there.
In your words, what's the purpose of Skydeck?
Oh my God. Somebody's going to fact check me on this mission statement, right? And I'm going to be very sad about it when I get the emails from my coworkers. Honestly, to me, if I was to put it in like a very bite-sized deck, it would be 15 minutes of inspiration, right? That's really what we're trying to do. It's about HBS alumni sharing experiences from their lives and career that can help other people deal with similar issues, right? And sometimes it's storytelling. Storytelling usually gets to that. But inspiration is really, I think, the key word in all of that, And I think we'll get into some of that as we get into the episode that I talk about today. But 15 minutes of inspiration is kind of a mantra I think about.
I like that. That's pretty short and sweet, to the point.
Yeah.
So you mentioned this episode before we talked today. I asked you to pick one of your favorites from the entire archive by Skydeck. And this episode is called A Shout Through Time. Published back in 2018, so a long time ago. But tell me a little bit about what this episode is about and why it's special to you.
Oh, man, I'll try and be short about this one. But this one I feel like, it's 5 years old, right? You would have thought I brought up something that we did more recently. But this one had so many incredible storytelling elements. And I'm going to try and do it justice in a real short take here. But let me give you as much context as I can really quickly. We had an alum who was a World War II. He volunteered at crash sites in Italy, World War II crash sites. He would try to find remains, usually dog tags or some identifying information, and connect those remains to families who had, been, oftentimes soldiers would just be listed as missing, right? They would go down in a field in Italy, and that family would never have that kind of closure, right? It was just that they would lose a family member and they wouldn't hear, and that missing in action, and then finally they would get a letter from the government, that said, it's taken too long, essentially, right? And so they would operate without this closure. So he was doing this great thing as like a volunteer for an organization. One day, he's going around some hillside in Italy, and he finds something. He finds the name Persic, right? I think it's a dog tag. And he says, man, he's having some real trouble. It's usually easier to find those connections, right? You go through the white pages. With Google, it makes it a lot easier. But he's striking out, And so he's an HBS alum, so he goes to the alumni directory and types in the name, right? This is like a shocking story. And he comes up with the name. He finds a Persic, right? And he's like, okay, let's give it a shot. That's my job, right? And so he makes the call. On the other end of the line is this guy who works at Twitter, Hold on, let me make sure he works at Twitter. Yeah, no, he works at Twitter. So he's this executive at Twitter.
At that time, Twitter, yes.
Yeah. Right. And so he's this executive at Twitter. He's in the airport, right? He's on his way somewhere. I think he's in Europe. But he just gets this call. And the other line, the guy on the other line is like, "Are you Tim Persic? And did you lose a great grandfather in World War II?" And this guy's like, "What?" It's like, "What are you talking about? Like, I'm about to get on a plane." Eventually, he sort of settles it and is like, yes, I'm that guy." And he's like, "I think I have, your great uncles or your great grandfather's, his dog tags, So it's this incredible story. From there, like the family sort of reconnects. He brings his family, and the family goes over to Italy. They have this beautiful procession through the streets of Italy, and there's this closure that this family needed for decades, right? Decades of time has passed. And then at the very end, this guy from Twitter just has this beautiful thought about time and history and closure. And quite frankly, it's a real tearjerker. Like it's just a beautiful, beautiful reflection that this guy ends in. And it's such a crazy, amazing story. Like it's just, to me, as a storyteller, it has everything, and I still love it. It holds up.
All right, so we're going to take a listen to this clip right here. Okay, so coming back, it's an amazing story. What are the chances that two HBS alum are going to get together in this way? And then I was also wondering, what are the chances that you and your team came across the story in the first place?
Yeah, so it's crazy, right? Like the idea also that he used like a school tool to find this guy, it's such an advertisement for like the HBS Alumni Network, right? Like you could make a great TV commercial about the alumni directory based on this. But the only reason that we found it, and this is, all really due to our social media manager, is that we always have our antennas up for stuff like this, and he was smart enough to say, hey, listen, there's something really here. So we heard about it naturally on Twitter because this gentleman who worked at Twitter told the story through a series of posts. And then, we reached out to him and said, listen, would you be willing to share this? And it was pretty emotional for him. And the conversation was pretty emotional. And then, Piero, the guy in Italy, who was the other alum who found the remains, was more than happy to tell the story, not to mention he has the greatest accent on the planet. So it made for great radio, But it was because we're constantly looking for stories, right? And we know what a good story looks like and the dimensions of it and what it takes. So, yes, the randomness of it is incalculable, but the fact that we found it is not as surprising. I think we do a good job as to finding things like this, right? Yeah.
So you mentioned in this episode that this format for an episode was a little different from the usual format, because the usual format is kind of more like host interview structure, like one-on-one conversations. So how did you build into this more narrative style? And in that experience, like, what was surprising to you or maybe challenging about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. We had done small experiments with narration, right? And mostly it was because the subject was complex or, it needed a little paraphrasing, right? And so we'd hop in and do a little narration to either move the story along or just sort of explain the subject a little bit more. I think in this case, we really storyboarded it. We're like, what is the best way to tell this story? We could have Piero and Tim on there, but that feels like we're not doing it justice, right? It would feel like you wouldn't have the emotional sense of it. You really wouldn't have the cadence or the tone we were looking for. So we scripted it. And we scripted it. We had never scripted something before, like of this nature, but we built a storyboard, right? We took the transcript and I said, okay, we got to start it here because that's when Piero finds the thing. And then you just build it in blocks, right? And it was totally new for us at the time. But I have to say, from that experience, we built a little bit of muscle there, and we've since done like longer, huge narration pieces that are little mini series that are like using this kind of model. We've executed 2 other small mini series, I think, that are highly effective, right? So it really helped us see a new way of doing something in a way that's really exciting.
How have you seen your hosting style change? Like from 5 years ago to today?
Yeah, I think I'm probably more agile, right? Like I think I used to think so much about how I could, while we were in conversation, think about how I could weave in the next thing, right? Like how I have an arc, right? I have an arc in mind and I need to get that. How can I weave what you're saying into that next thing? I need to get to this destination. I think now I really want to understand what the people are saying a little bit more and react more in the moment, right? I think, it was a new thing for me, right? I wasn't as confident, and now I feel a little bit more confident in how in allowing ourselves to take a bit of a side route or to be tangential or to digress a little bit, because sometimes the audience needs it, right? And sometimes, quite frankly, I need that understanding too. But so I think I'm much less rigid than I used to be in my conversation, and I think that's really useful, right? Because I was always so not thoughtful, but I was always so aware of time, right? And I wanted to make sure that this went, I was like, I got to be 10, 12 to 15 minutes. That's it. And again, no extra talk, right? But I think that does a disservice to the listener.
You're thoughtful too.
Sometimes. Listen, we're only a few minutes into this. Don't judge so soon.
All right, so let's talk about the prep process a little bit.
Yeah.
For an episode like this, who's involved in the prep phase, and do you just make a document? Like how much time do you spend on this?
Yeah, this one was a longer one. But preparation for me was 2 pre-production interviews, right? Talked to both of them before, made sure that we had the tech stuff down. Listen, it was 2018. We didn't have Riverside back then. Nobody was on Zoom, right? So with Tim Perzik, we were in Twitter headquarters, and there was like, he was doing it late night, so the cleaning crew was making a lot of noise. Like, it was like back in the day, early podcasting 5 years ago. So much has happened since then, but you really had to be more concerned about that sort of stuff, because the democratization of tools has just ramped up in just a half a decade, right? Like, look at the mic I'm speaking into. Everybody has these days, but back in the day they didn't, right? And some in the early days, 2014, we would send people to local FM radio stations because they had studios, right? If we were going to do it remotely, they'd have to have like being a team. So yeah, it's, oh man, what was the original question here?
How do you approach the prep process? Yeah.
You can edit this, right, Robert?
Yeah.
So a lot of it was technical, right? Figuring out where people would be and what tools they were going to use and how we could get good audio. Yeah. The other part was, again, I'd go back to understanding what the structure of it would be, right? You know, we knew we were going to tell this story. How did we want to go about it? So you had to ask specific questions, right? If you were going to, just like if you're going to make a movie, you have to kind of know what scenes you're doing first and how the characters get introduced. It was one of the first times we really used music for tone and pace. And that was fun, but, you know, it takes a lot of time to figure out the music process and the licensing. So that was new for us. But this was honestly a real passion project. There was, of course, my team weighed in and all that other sort of stuff. But I must have spent, all told, I probably spent 20 hours on this, which seems like not a lot. But when you only have a 40-hour week and you have so many other deliverables, it's a lot. But honestly, it meant a lot to me. I really thought this was an important story to tell.
What has the reaction been to, yes, this podcast, or sort of this episode, but just the podcast more in general?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's so hard to tell sometimes with audio, but one of the big things that I get is anecdotal feedback. Well, there's 2 levels of anecdotal feedback for me. One is I'll get these notes that are just like jaw-dropping. We did a story about a fellow who lost his family's fortune while he was at HBS. He's 27 years old. He was like the son of the biggest Australian media empire that known to man, right? And he lost it all while he was 27 at HBS. He told that story on our podcast. And he sent me some of the emails that he got about alumni who heard it, friends of his who heard it, pulled over to the side of the road in tears, who shared some really intimate details about how it moved them. And it really reminds me of the value of this medium, right? It's in your ears, you know, and it feels so much more personal, right? And it really speaks to the mission and vision of the podcast, which is, you know, the personal side of business, you know? And the second anecdotal thing is PR inquiries, right? We hear a lot. When you do a good job, people want a part of it, right? Like when you do something excellent, people are like, how can I have a piece of that? And the rise of PR inquiries for Skydeck has just shot through the roof. Like it's just a massive, massive thing that people, you know, want to be a part of. And I welcome that, right? I absolutely welcome that. The more people know about it, I'm so happy that they see the value in it and that they see what we're doing and they, you know, they want to engage with it. That's so positive to me.
When you say PR, you're talking about people wanting to be guests, right?
Correct. It's
Okay.
usually like somebody, somebody has listened to it. What are you looking for? Would you have an opening, or I have an idea for it. And you can tell the people who are really into it are be like, I heard your last, or they'll contact you directly. They won't contact you through a PR agency. Then know they're a fan.
How do you think people find the podcast? How's it get out there?
It's funny. So we did a reader survey about a year ago, and one of the things that we found is that some great percentage of our listeners listen to it, and I want to say it's 10 or 15% listen to it on the web. Meaning they open up a Safari, they open it up on Safari, they're just listening to it on their desktop. And so when I saw that, I was like, well, that is fascinating to me, right? And it turns out that happens because we push it out in our All Alumni newsletter, right? Which goes out every week. And so they're clicking on those links and they're opening it up just on their desktop. So a lot of people are finding out about it through our e-news channel, through a newsletter, which is surprising because typically there's the audio channels help you find audio channels, I will say this, anecdotally, we did a mid-roll or a post-roll ad on one of our partner podcasts at HBS called Cold Call, which is excellent. And our audience doubled. And that was in 2015 or 16, right? So there's a multitude of ways people are getting here. But the most effective are, of course, digital, I would say.
Just to dig into that a little bit deeper, so with the newsletter, is the podcast kind of on top, or is it like at the end of the newsletter?
Yeah, so it's a series of stories, right? Like our newsletter will have alumni news, and so there's like 3 stories at the top, and it'll be some, maybe something that is run in the magazine, maybe something that has happened online or from social, and then an episode of the podcast, right? And so it comes out every week, and click-through rate is through the roof on that thing, so it gets a lot of good traffic. And let me walk back one thing that I said earlier about digital means being the only means of dissemination. In that same survey, we did find that some 20% of Skydeck listeners first heard about it through a print ad that we ran in the magazine. So it's not, I shouldn't put it off the table, but I had always thought that jump from print to digital was just like not possible, right? Because I don't operate that way.
Yeah.
But apparently some good measure of people do.
And when was that? Like, when did that magazine come out?
Well, we advertise it every issue.
Every issue.
Yeah.
Is it like a QR code, or is it just like, hey, we have
No, it was just it was just legitimately an episode. Well, it's a collection of all the school's podcasts.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd say about marketing, because I think it's important, we do live event marketing. Like we tape a live episode of the podcast at reunions, right? So like, we have a tent on campus during reunions where we're bringing people in and asking them like a simple question about business, right? Like, what's the best piece of business advice you've ever received? What was your first job and what did it teach you, right? And so we have this presence, right? We're on your event program. You're sitting down, you're watching us tape this, right? And honestly, I think that's been one of the biggest factors in our growth, right? People know it because they're coming. We make sure we have a very good guest, right? We pack the room, right? And that live event marketing portion of it is, I think, has been really effective.
How often do you do that? Like,
reunions are twice a year. We try to do it. So we try to do it twice a year.
And turnout on the podcast recording is
what, like the audience?
Yeah.
Oh, it depends. Like we did one on happiness. With my great colleague April White, who's moved on since, but that filled 3 rooms. So you're talking about at least 300 people. My colleague Jen Flint just did one on love and money at a recent at our last reunions. That definitely filled at least one room. Went to overflow beyond that. So I don't know, what is that? That's got to be 100 plus, 150 or something like that. It depends on what you're actually, like, it's all dependent on what you're talking about. Love and money, yeah, people want to know about that, happiness. If you're doing investment in the space sector, you're going to have a very specific group of people that go in there. But if your secondary mission is engagement, I will say when you run those niche sort of subjects, the amount of engagement between, like, in the crowd is off the charts, right? Like the business card, trading at the end, the conversations that it starts, there's some secondary benefits to stuff like that.
Just to ask you one more question about audience, because in previous conversations we talked about this, but how would you kind of explain the demographics of the HBS audience?
Yeah, I mean, so they're older, I would say. They tend older than your usual audience, but the HBS alumni audience tends and trends a little bit older, I think, I want to say that same survey put it at around 50 or so, right? And that is not typical of a general podcast audience. I think when we talk about a general podcast audience, we always think about that 18 to 34, right?
Yeah.
But I think based on the topics we talk about and the subjects that we have on the podcast and our marketing channels in general, that kind of makes sense,
It's fascinating, fascinating data point, because it is different from most other podcasts.
It is.
Even other alumni podcasts.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
Huh.
Well, yes, that's something new for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, because typically, we do see the largest age groups typically being like 50 and below, not around 50 and above.
Yeah.
It might just, to your point, be something unique to the Harvard business community, but
yeah,
maybe.
It could be. I guess if I was to make not a suggestion, but if I was to hypothesize, it would be perhaps do more to marketing channels that we use, right? E-newsletter has the same, very similar demographics, right? And we see a lot of traffic from there, right? And the fact that 20% found us through print, right? Print trends older too. So
yeah,
it's I think sometimes where it's getting more traction, right, is probably why it could explain a lot of that, right? But it's also our topics, right? It tends to be a little bit not C-suite heavy, but management and leadership stuff that I think even if you asked HBR about it, they would probably be similar. But it's just a guess. It's a hypothesis.
Do you have a sense of how many listeners are kind of external to the Harvard audience?
I don't. But it's always funny. I think about this a lot because the way that we've defined our podcast is Skydeck. And Skydeck only means something to people if they went to HBS, right? Skydeck is like the way that the seats are set up at Harvard Business School historically, like it's big like stadium seating almost, right? And there's a circle. And the first level is the worm deck, right? And that's the the sort of eager students ready to answer who've like drank their coffee and done their casework, And then there's like I forget what's the other. Well, the worm deck is right in the first one, and then Skydeck is like maybe if you are coming in a little bit late, or maybe if you don't want to get called on, you'd be up on the Skydeck. And it's also where you sort of meet before class and converse, and so that's why we named it. But it's a very particular HBS thing, and so we didn't build this to aim for the external audience, right? We built it to build community, specifically within the HBS community. So the audience is very finite, the way it is designed. The way it's designed right now is a very finite audience, just the way the Alumni magazine does, right? We have like 80,000 alumni. You're not building it for people beyond that. And so you are limiting your audience by doing that, by designing it that way.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No. I think we always think about that when we look at the numbers, right? When we look at data and metrics, because you have to have that caveat in there when you consider it.
When you think about the future of Skydeck, what are you excited about? And let me say this. This episode's going to publish like next year. So what are you excited about next year?
So it's funny. We're in the middle of this like real content strategy rethinking, right? We have to redesign the magazine. We're probably going to rethink a lot of our tools and systems and processes and also mediums. I feel like the potential for Skydeck to reach new audience is very exciting to me. And even a recentering potentially of the podcast itself. Like I mentioned, this episode and so many of the narrative episodes have been such good experiments for us to grow and stretch. But I think there's an opportunity to sort of refocus it and keep the podcast a little bit more narrowly defined. And I'm excited about what that could be and how that could reshape our thinking. But I'm mostly excited about how we approach the strategic, or how we approach content marketing, and how we think about better ways to socialize audio and really get younger listeners engaged in what we're doing. Because I think what we're doing is executed at a high level, and I'm excited about figuring out how to get it to more ears.
We're going to have to do a part 2 catch-up episode, see how that goes next year.
Oh, I'd be happy to do it, Robert. I'd be happy to do it.
All right. Well, let's do that. Dan, I just want to thank you again for coming on the show. Great having you.
Robert, it was my pleasure. I was excited to see you again, and thank you so much for having me.